Hey guys, what's up? Zambash here. This is going to be a review of sorts of Lords of the Fallen. I wouldn't really call this like a hardcore full review because this is unscripted and it's more like just a collection of thoughts. I historically haven't done any game reviews on this channel, but I've watched a number of reviews of this game and I felt like I needed to make some kind of video about it because I gotta say, I just really disagree with a lot of the reasons that a lot of the negative reviews bring out. So I felt like I needed to put another perspective out there, and this will be mostly spoiler free. Obviously, there's just some gameplay in the background here. I'm going to be talking over. There won't be any major bosses killed during this footage. And I'll try not to say anything that spoilers major story elements. But I just want to talk about the game a bit, my impressions of it, and why I think a lot of the negative reviewers are kind of off base on this. And a lot of the things they're complaining about really kind of boil down to the same sorts of complaints that many of those people give crap to website game journalists for complaining about. And rightfully so. I think they're silly complaints, but I think a lot of these people are essentially making the same kinds of complaints about Lords of the Fallen without realizing it. And it's a general trend that I've fallen into myself with certain games in the past, and that I think a lot of these reviewers are falling into, particularly in the Souls-like genre. It's been really prominent as of late, but this has happened for years of other people, or in other genres that we'll talk about as well. So, I will start off by saying that, overall, I really like Lords of the Fallen. I think it's a really fun game. I've beat it once, and this is another playthrough on a different character that there's footage of going on in the back here. That being said, there are a lot of legitimate flaws with this game, and things that could definitely be improved. A lot of them technical flaws. The devs have been really active so far in addressing issues and stuff as they come up, but I do still get crashes occasionally. I've been fortunate that my performance has been really good from the start for the most part. I haven't really had any significant frame drops or slowdowns. Any that you see in this video are just a result of the recording software introducing a little slowness and frame lag. But for the most part, the game has run really smooth for me. For the first couple days, I was getting quite a lot of crashes, specifically in certain areas. Like the Sunless Skein, I was crashing a lot my first time through there. Most of those have been resolved, but I do still occasionally get crashes, so that needs to be fixed. Another obvious limitation that needs to be worked on, the lock-on with the camera in this game is one of the worst I've ever experienced. It is extremely unreliable, inconsistent, and difficult to lock on to the things that you're actually trying to lock onto if there are multiple enemies or objects around. That could definitely use an overhaul and be made a lot better. I didn't encounter any large bugs per se while going through the game, but enemy AI is pretty dodgy a lot of the times, and it's not particularly difficult to get yourself or enemies stuck on level geometry if you try to, or even if you don't try to. So some of those things could definitely be tightened up. I got stuck literally just like sprinting at something a couple of times. I slightly phased through and then was stuck behind like a little pillar or whatever, and had to either use the item to sacrifice my vigor or try and lure an enemy over to kill me so I could then go and re-grab my vigor because I was just stuck. And I've gotten various enemies stuck on geometry when they do certain attacks or whatever. They can get stuck on things and then AI just bugs out and they just sit there while you kill them. So those things definitely need fixing. I do agree to some extent that some of the enemy placement is frustrating in areas. I'm not going to say bad because this ties into one of the major points that I'm going to be talking about, because this is a big complaint that a lot of people said is, "Oh, enemy placement's horrible. I hate how the enemies are placed." I don't think that's really a valid complaint for the most part, but I will grant that there are certain areas where the enemy placement is pretty frustrating. Without being spoilerish, I will say that the ending of the game that you are most likely to get on your first playthrough, if you just kind of do what the main people you run into tell you to do, has one of the worst, most anticlimactic, disappointing final fights of any RPG I've experienced. So that was a major letdown without going into anything specific on that. Enemy variety isn't great. That's a valid complaint a lot of people have pointed out. They do reuse a lot of enemies, even in like very different areas. Some of the move sets on different enemies are essentially copy-pasted from each other and just thrown on a different model, but the enemy is mechanically identical. That's a little disappointing. And I definitely agree with the idea that there is way too much reuse of boss enemies as normal enemies later. And that would be okay if it was like much later, but sometimes you fight a boss enemy and then within the next 2 minutes you're now fighting that enemy as a regular mob. I don't think that's great, and that could definitely be improved as well. More enemy variety, less reuse of bosses as regular enemies. Let's see, what other negatives do I have to get out of the way first before I go into some of the other things I want to talk about. Overall, I agree with what I've heard a couple people say, that for the most part, boss fights are a bit too easy, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the bosses just don't have very large move sets for the most part in this game. If you go back to some of the older Souls games, or even like Dark Souls 3, I think they're kind of comparable to those. The enemies just don't have really big move sets, so usually within a couple of tries you've kind of got them figured out, and I feel like they're a little too easy for the most part. And there also just aren't a ton of bosses in the game. So far the boss count is kind of limited, especially compared to something like Elden Ring. Obviously this game doesn't have nearly the size of studio or funding that Elden Ring did, so like that's a silly comparison, but it is somewhat disappointing, just the lack of bosses. And I would agree that there are a few too many gimmick-type boss fights where you're not actually directly fighting the boss, but instead you're fighting some gimmick in the arena or with other enemies around the boss. And there are a couple of bosses that I could see being pretty frustrating. You'll see one in this video, actually, the guy with the wolves. Bosses with ads don't work super well in games like this, in my opinion. You'll learn how to deal with them. Obviously, since I'd been through it on the first playthrough, I knew how to do the fight on this playthrough. But I don't really like bosses with little ads that are harassing you while you're trying to fight the boss, generally in games like this. So that's pretty much most of the negatives out of the way, a lot of those being technical issues that still need to be resolved. But now I want to talk about, let's see, some positives, I suppose. I thought the story was okay overall. You know, it's not amazing, and I'm working on this second playthrough to do a different ending, and I want to do a third playthrough to get the third different ending. But the characters are fairly interesting. There's cool little lore tidbits on a lot of the items, just like there are in the Souls games. I didn't like the combat a lot at first, but I learned to like it. And I've seen the combat as a big complaint against a lot of reviewers. And this is where I'm going to start getting into some of the problems that I have with some of the reviews of this game. And of other reviews that I've seen of games in the past. This tends to be a problem in new games that are coming into a pretty well-established genre. In this case, the so-called Souls-like genre. It's been really prominent in this genre as of late, this kind of thought process that I think is just sort of inherently contradictory and against what you should be looking for in a game. And that is that people say either the combat is bad or the level design is bad because the enemy placement is bad. Not to single anyone out, I think Ratatosker is his name. I believe his review is really the only one that I watched like all the way through, because his was like the first one that I watched that was quite negative on the game. And then I started watching several others, but it seemed like they were mostly just kind of parroting the same points, and I want to address some of those. In his video, Ratatosker said that he didn't really like the speed of the combat or the speed of the weapon swinging. In my opinion, I think he was just kind of off on that in general. He was saying that, like, you know, regular swords have the speed of, like, daggers in the Souls games. I don't think that's really a problem. He was also saying it's like way too non-committal and you can roll out of stuff. I had the opposite experience. Obviously on the second playthrough I'm playing a super big slow weapon, but even on a fast weapon, I actually found that a lot of the times I felt like I needed to be a lot more precise with my roll timing and stuff in this game. Perhaps you can roll too quickly after an attack, though you really can with most weapons in the Souls games as well. But in particular, in the Souls games, you can spam roll really hard. Elden Ring has a lot of bosses that will punish spam rolling and panic rolling. But in general, especially in earlier entries in the Souls series, you could just kind of spam roll through everything. That is not the case in Lords of the Fallen at all. There's a pretty big gap between dashes and rolls you can do. So if you roll too early, you can't just immediately roll again and avoid the attack. You're probably going to get hit because your timing was bad. Anyways, that was just kind of a tangent, the weapon speed thing of the combat. The main thing I wanted to address is this complaint that enemy placement, Ratatoskers, I believe that was his name, sorry if I'm getting that wrong, specifically acknowledged that enemy placement is a part of level design, and that's why he felt that the level design was bad in Lords of the Fallen. However, acknowledging that enemy placement is part of level design, when watching his footage, I noticed that, well, his complaint was, oh, it's very common to have several melee enemies fighting you while a ranged enemy is trying to fight you. But I noticed that in all of the gameplay that I was seeing, he was just running around trying to melee everything. And this is where I think the fundamental issue is when a game comes into an established genre, say Souls-like. Let's be real, in most of the Souls games and Elden Ring, you can progress through the game fairly easily just by R1 spamming with your melee weapon on everything. And I think players get used to that. And because they get used to the way things are done in a genre, they'll say they want new and different takes on the genre because they're getting bored of playing the same thing over and over. And yet then a lot of the complaints of this game that I've seen essentially boil down to, I don't like this game because it's not exactly the same as the games that I was playing previously, despite saying I want something new, and I'm unwilling to learn how to play this game, so it's bad. That's where I get into this is like website game journalist level of complaints about a game. A game is not bad because it's different than previous games in the genre, and it's not bad to have to learn to play a game in a new way. When I watched him struggling with multiple melee enemies while a ranged enemy was shooting at him, I said in my head immediately, you're supposed to use all of the tools in your toolkit. You need to take out either magic or throwables or a bow or crossbow, shoot the ranged enemy, kill them before you even bother engaging the melee enemies, and then the fight will be easy for you. And how about you use either a spell or a grenade or an explosive bolt from your crossbow, and you can take out more than one of those melee enemies at a time, instead of thinking that the fight is frustrating or difficult because you're only using one tiny tool in your toolkit and just trying to melee everything down. As I said, I've struggled with this with games in the past, and I struggled right at the beginning of Lords of the Fallen because I was right in the middle of like my 20th Elden Ring playthrough when I started playing this game, and I started out just trying to melee everything as well, and I was like, this doesn't really work, I'm not really enjoying this combat, and then I was like, wait a second. This enemy placement that you've acknowledged is part of the level design is telling you you need to use the tools that are in your toolkit. And then it starts to make a lot more sense. You're like, oh, I have a dedicated slot on this character that only ranged weapons can be used in, whether that be spells, throwables, or bows and crossbows. And I have several buttons that I can access to use different spells or throwables or arrows or bolts instantly whenever I go into my ranged mode. I think the developers placed these enemies in the levels in a way saying you need to use your whole toolkit to get through them. So I think a lot of the complaints about enemy placement and difficulty of the levels and stuff, from what I've seen, is boiling down to players, including reviewers, that are just unwilling to use the tools that have been given to them to play the game in the way that it's clearly intended to be played. To me, those, supposedly bad enemy placements aren't really bad. They're there to encourage you to use the systems in the game to their fullest and say, you can't just R1 melee spam your way through this game like you perhaps could in some of the Souls games. And if that's not for you, that's fine. But I don't think that's a flaw of the game. I think that's your unwillingness to use the tools or learn to play the game the way that it's clearly intended to be played based on that level design and enemy placement. So that's my big rant about that point. I think people need to realize that when something is new and different, that's okay. You've been asking for new and different in a genre. Use the new tools and stuff that you've given to you, and let the way that the game is designed guide you in how you're supposed to be playing it. You can't just play the game the exact same way that you played all of the previous games in the genre and then be mad when it doesn't work in this game. And as I said, I've fallen into this in the past as well. For me, a big one was Monster Hunter. I really didn't like Monster Hunter when I started playing Monster Hunter World for the first time, and I dropped it pretty quickly. And the reason was, I had also been coming off of a Souls-like binge, and I was trying to play Monster Hunter in the same way that I would play Dark Souls or Elden Ring. I thought I could just run in on these big monsters and, attack, roll, attack, roll, roll, attack, roll. I was getting dumpstered, and I felt the combat was mega slow and clunky and unresponsive and just didn't like it at all. But then, after taking a break for a long time, and also incidentally taking quite a break from Souls-like games, I came back and I was like, you know what? My brother in particular really likes this game, and I'd like to be able to play it with him. And a lot of people really like this game. I need to learn to play this game, not try and play it like I've played other games previously and be mad that that doesn't work in this game. And now I really like Monster Hunter. I went through all of World, really like that, and I've done everything in Monster Hunter Rise, and I really enjoyed that, and I can't wait for the next Monster Hunter game. I think Monster Hunter's awesome, but I didn't get that appreciation until I stopped trying to apply the way that I played previous games to Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter is its own type of game that has to be played in a certain way to work and be enjoyable, and I think Lords of the Fallen is the same way. You can't play Lords of the Fallen exactly the same way as you play Dark Souls or Elden Ring and have a good experience with it. I would certainly agree with that. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It means that you need to learn to play this game. So that's my main complaint. My main complaint with the complaints of a lot of reviewers is I think they basically boil down to people who are unwilling to learn to play this game the way that it is designed to be played, and so they think that makes it a bad game because they can't just apply exactly the same way that they've played other Souls-likes to this game. This game is very unique in the way its combat and its level design and enemy placement work, and I don't think that's accidental or bad design. It's the way the developers are encouraging you to use the full toolkits that are available on your characters. One other little thing I will mention here at the end, another thing that stood out to me a bit in some of these reviews, and that is general complaints about the Umbral system, and again, I think that boils down to people are upset that this game isn't exactly like previous Souls-likes that they've played, and so they think it's bad. I thought the Umbral's really interesting. Are there sometimes a little bit janky enemy placements in Umbral? Yes, I would say this is the one area where the enemy placement really does get frustrating sometimes, is in Umbral when you're needing to interact with certain interactables that are really difficult because of the bad lock-on system and you're simultaneously getting swarmed by annoying enemies. It was really only in Umbral that I could see some of those frustrating enemy placements being valid criticisms. But overall, I think the Umbral system's cool. It adds a cool twist. It adds some minor puzzle elements to levels, and if you don't like puzzle elements at all, then, I can understand you not liking that. But a lot of people just saying it's bad because this and that, I, again, just think boils down to people don't want to learn to play the game in a different way than the previous games they've played. And also, man, several reviewers I saw had footage of them just rage quitting when they get eaten by the big Umbral monster when they try to pick up an item and saying it's BS. I got eaten by the Umbral monsters a lot too, and you know what I did? I decided to learn, so I said, how can I tell that this is an Umbral monster? Here's the trick. If it's a very gentle flame that is moving very little, it's a real item. If it's a wildly waving and flailing flame like it's in a windstorm, it's an Umbral thing. Soul flay the item, you'll kill the thing, and you can pick up the drops from it. That's my thoughts on Lords of the Fallen. Great game overall. Various technical issues that still need to be addressed. And I really think people need to stop giving bad reviews and bad complaints about something purely because they can't play it exactly the same as a previous game they've played when they're asking for something new.